Let's get a little more from Sherwin Bryce-Pease. He's live for us in the United States tonight. Sherwin, tell us a little more about how this is sinking in the day after.
Well, we appropriately, I think, used visuals of former President Barack Obama and Michelle Obama attending the funeral of former First Lady Barbara Bush. And I think that just talks to the sentiment of what many here view as the death of this deal. As you've heard in that report, a great deal of negative reaction, the United States finding itself very isolated on this issue. And that, I think, speaks to the new leadership that President Trump has surrounded himself with. Of course, he's had a number of resignations in his National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, Rex Tillerson, the former Secretary of State, senior officials in his administration who had argued for the United States to remain in the JCPOA. But, of course, those people are no longer there. He has a new National Security Advisor, a conservative hawk named John Bolton. And having those kinds of voices in his ears has driven the United States president to remove the United States from, as the EU foreign policy chief very aptly coined it, that this is not a bilateral agreement where one party can move away. This is a multilateral agreement where all parties were in agreement that this, well, certainly 95% of the parties were in agreement that this deal should go ahead. So a lot of concern about what this means, a possible rupture in the relationship between European allies and the United States. Of course, China and Russia and Germany, who are also party to this agreement, are adamant that this should go ahead. And Francis, in addition to that, the International Atomic Energy Agency released a statement after President Trump's announcement reaffirming that this is the most vigorous nuclear inspection of any country in the world as it pertains to Iran, and that so far, in terms of this 2015 agreement, Iran has complied fully with that agreement. So very much you're seeing a backlash here, even though it's being done so in certainly a very respectful way, but certainly nonetheless a backlash to what President Trump has done.
And Sherwin, the backlash was quick. It seemed like all the other parties to the deal immediately spoke out. Does that suggest there's a hardening of attitudes? Is anyone in the administration worried that the United States could be isolating itself?
Well, I think it speaks more to how these things play themselves out, Francis. I mean, this decision by President Trump wasn't a surprise to anyone that has watched him over the last, since certainly before him coming into office in January of 2016. But certainly he has spoken as a campaigner, as a candidate for president, that he didn't think this was a good deal, that it was an insane deal. But also more broadly, one begins to expect this from this administration in terms of what was achieved under Barack Obama and how can we undo that. Whether you're talking about the resolution where the United States abstained here at the United Nations and the Security Council as it pertains to the illegal settlement activity being carried out by Israel. You've seen this administration try and undercut that with the announcement that the embassy would move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in violation of Security Council resolutions. Whether you're talking about the withdrawal from NAFTA, the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was this deal that the Obama administration had a free trade agreement they had tried to negotiate with Asian countries. They were about to sign this agreement. President Trump comes into office and withdraws the country. The Paris Climate Change Agreement is another example. So what you're seeing here, it might be called America First in terms of Donald Trump's doctrine, but it is also being seen as trying to undercut what his predecessor has tried to achieve.
So what does this actually mean, the logistics of it? Because inspectors have been going into Iran, the other parties, the other countries are still on board. Will they go in and that protects the US to some extent? Or does it look like from Iran's reaction, this is falling apart completely?
Well, the truth, Francis, is that no one really knows. What we've seen now, what the implications of this decision by President Trump is that he has now reimposed, he signed a memorandum after that announcement yesterday, essentially saying that in 90 days, sanctions that were lifted in terms of the JCPOA will be reimposed. We saw a tweet from his new ambassador to Germany tweeting to German companies that they need to stop wrapping up their businesses in Iran. How will this, for example, affect telecommunications giant MTN that, as you know, has operations in there and is trying to repatriate billions of dollars from that country, how will being cut off from the United States, the global economic system, vis-a-vis these sanctions being imposed by Washington, how will that affect companies, multinational companies that are operating in Iran? Certainly post the adoption of the JCPOA, because essentially sanctions were lifted, and any reasonable business looking at Iran saw a great deal of potential there. Airbus and Boeing, for example, have huge contracts with the Iranian regime. How is that going to affect Boeing, which is an American company, and France, which has invested a great deal, certainly in trying to keep the United States in the agreement, but Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom, all making trips to Washington and seemingly failing in this high-level effort to keep them in.
Sherwin, last question. I guess here in South Africa, we're trying always to gauge sort of public support for the US president. Do people love him? Are they starting to hate him? If you look at the media, for example, today, would you say it was overwhelmingly critical or supportive of Trump?
I think if you talk about ordinary Americans, they probably don't even understand what the JCPOA is. Many argue that President Trump himself probably doesn't fully understand the real the nuts and bolts of this agreement. I think in terms of the media, I think there has been a more critical investigation, analysis of what this decision means. But it's also in the United States being overwhelmed now by the release of these 3 US detainees in North Korea that are now on a plane en route from Pyongyang back to the United States with the new Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of distraction going on. In the background, you also have new revelations about Trump's personal lawyer accepting funds from companies in terms of lobbying this administration. There's always a lot going on around this President Francis. He's also today threatened in a tweet to take the credentials away from journalists that don't provide positive coverage of this administration. So there's always a lot going on. It's difficult to keep up, but we do our best.
All right. Thank you very much, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, reporting live from New York.